Good evening and welcome to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Nilanthan. The ongoing Middle East conflict is on everyone's mind these days. Where will we end up? When will it end? And to discuss this and much more, I have with me Mr. Nilanthan Niruthan, Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies. Good evening, Nilanthan.
Good evening.
Right. So, Nilanthan, what's your prognosis? What are the scenarios for the end of this conflagration, this astonishing level of violence which we are seeing over the past week or so now?
So there are three basic scenarios that I can think of. The first is that Iran somehow manages to hold on despite the firepower and things fizzle out because it risks turning into a larger regional or international conflict. But I think the more likely scenario is that this either ends in regime change or some kind of, as Trump would say, surrender. Some kind of either conditional or unconditional surrender, because at this point of time, the Israelis seem to have realized that the time is running out for them as well. The support that the United States has been giving them, both under the Biden administration and the Trump administration, is significantly lesser than what previous American regimes have been willing to extend to Israel. So I think they feel that working against Israel and working against Iran and toppling the Iranian regime is the only real safe option for them. So I don't see the Israelis stopping anytime soon. If anything, the Americans might join in, but the Americans pressuring the Israelis to stop anytime soon, I don't think is in the cards.
Now, you spoke of regime change. This is an extraordinarily messy thing to do.
Always.
There are wars where two countries fight each other, or even a larger number of countries, but it's not necessarily for regime change. You can defeat your enemy, if it may be a neighboring country or one further away, and get your whatever you were fighting for. But the regime stays in place, the government. But when you are aiming for regime change, the question is, what's going to replace that regime? And it's always a mess, isn't it? I mean, if you take a look at the regime changes we've seen in the Middle East itself over the past few decades. If you take Libya, I mean, Gaddafi was toppled. Of course, he was a dictator, but after he was toppled, we still have a civil war going on in Libya. And then Syria, again, another dictator, Assad, but after he was toppled, again, it took several years before the current regime took office in Syria, and the fighting continues in some areas of Syria. So, and then you look at Yemen, again, regime change, whether it's internal or external, but the fighting and the human suffering is going on. So it's all about who's going to replace the current regime. And is there an answer to that? I don't see any opposition in Iran which could actually take over.
So you're absolutely right. So if you're not going to learn your lesson from Libya and Syria and even Iraq and Afghanistan, to add to that list, so you're never really going to learn that lesson. I think the major problem right now is that the Israelis have realized that the Iranian regime is at its weakest according to their calculations. So, for example, you see now the son of the Pahlavi dynasty now contributing through international media saying kick them out. You have Netanyahu asking ordinary Iranians to stand up against the regime. In fact, the operation is called Operation Rising Lion, as you know. Now I don't see this being covered in any of the news stories, but if you were to look at the Iranian flag before the Khomeini revolution, it was the same tricolors with a lion. And when you look at the Iranian flag today, it's the same tricolors except the lion's been taken away and there's the word God, Allah, put in there at the center. So symbolically, the idea of calling this Operation Rising Lion is not a coincidence. And this instigation that the Israelis are hoping will happen, where Iranians start going in for regime change by themselves, I don't think that's quite likely, because as we both know, when an external threat attacks you, the chances of public opinion going against you is very low. It typically tends to get consolidated. And I think that's what's happening at the moment. But look, the Israelis see this as an existential threat. As far as they're concerned, if they had something like the Pahlavi dynasty back in power, well, we've got to remember that Iran at one point of time was the second country to recognize Israel as a sovereign state. It was Turkey and then Iran, which recognized the first two Muslim majority countries, which recognized Israel as a sovereign state. And things were going very, very well between them until the 80s, until the Khomeini revolution. And in fact, even after that, a lot of people forget that the Israelis backed the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq war of the 80s. We all remember that Operation Babylon, where the Israelis took out Iraqi nuclear facilities. A lot of us tend to forget that it was with Iranian intelligence that it was done. The crippling of the Iraqi nuclear program was done by the Israelis.
This is prior to Saddam Hussein's...
this was in 1981.
Right.
By the Israelis with intelligence from Iran. And today Iran faces the same position, where the Israelis cannot allow them to... The Israelis don't even want the Iranians to have nuclear power for civilian purposes, because they don't really trust that it will stay civilian. So while I completely agree with you that regime change is always messy, while I completely agree with you that statistically the idea that some kind of moderate would now be in charge of Iran is very, very low, the Israelis once again feel that they have no choice. Look, any social survey and poll taken in the United States today shows that the younger demographic is far more anti-Israel than previous American demographics. The young American crowd today is as removed from Israel as any American age group. And if that partnership is broken as these guys get older and as public opinion shifts, then this is Israel's last chance to shape the Middle East according to its own visions and preferences. They might not get a chance after this.
Now that's interesting, because the 6 months that President Donald Trump has been in office have been very eventful, not just in terms of the world with the tariffs on and all that, that's a different matter, but for the Middle East. He's taken a lot of decisive decisions with regard to the US stance on the Middle East and the various aspects of the Middle East. So the pact with the Houthis in Yemen is one. Then his whole the recognition of the new Syrian regime, and of course then his amazing grand tour of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and a couple of other states. It altered the situation between the US and Israel and the Arab countries, don't you think?
Absolutely. In fact, even Trump's first term, nobody thought a guy like Trump would be capable of something like the Abraham Accords. Because when he came and he was supposed to be a madman and this was going to be the end of the world in 2016, but Trump managed to push in the Abraham Accords, which no US president has succeeded in doing before or since. I mean, there's only been Biden since then. And even this, as you rightly pointed out, shaking hands with al-Shara, the new leader of Syria, was seen as a major betrayal by the Israelis. the deal with the Houthis, where the Houthis were asked to leave the Bab el Mandeb Strait alone, and almost given a tacit green line to attack Israel if they wanted to, was seen as a major betrayal by the Israelis. Even going back to almost the Obama era nuclear deal talks was seen as a betrayal by the Israelis. So over the last 6 months, even though traditionally the narrative has been that the United States and Israel are steadfast allies through thick and thin, and even though that has been the case, clearly when we look at the Biden administration and when we look at the Trump administration, it's not the same partnership that it once was. This is a partnership that's crumbling, particularly as you rightly pointed out, the Saudis signing contracts for 300 billion, the Qataris signing contracts for 250 billion, the Emiratis signing contracts for something like 200 billion.
These are investments in the US.
Yes, with pledges of more as well. So and Trump is always an economic thinker. Trump thinks in terms of dimes and cents and how prosperity can be generated. And the Israelis are finding out that making America great again actually means America being prioritized rather than America and its allies being prioritized. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Trump has been one of the most impactful Western leaders in terms of Middle Eastern geopolitics in the last century, without a doubt.
And also the gifting of a new jet for Air Force One, that seemed like such a ridiculous thing. But that's very symbolic, don't you think? Because any other US president would have said, thank you very much, but no thank you, or we'll take it, but we'll use it for something else. Instead, he's actually going to use it for Air Force One, the presidential jet. And that will, of course, be very costly because there's a lot of upgradings which need to be done to that aircraft to turn it into Air Force One. But the very fact that a Middle Eastern nation was able to gift this, and he, took it with open arms despite all the criticism, I think that's also very symbolic.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, if we were to look at Trump's presidency, there might be many, many flaws there, but he understands symbolism very well. I would say both Trump and Obama understood symbolism very, very well. And when you look at their diplomatic visits and when you look at their diplomatic engagements, there are many things that pop up in both presidencies where we would say that perhaps there might be some practical shortcomings in this gesture, but there are lots of symbolic things happening beneath the surface which signal towards greater avenues in the future. So yes, Trump, I would say, is often not given enough credit for his understanding of some of these symbolic and nominal gestures in foreign policy.
Now, let's talk about the history of Iran-US relations, which many people, especially in the younger generations, wouldn't know about. And I'm talking back to, first and foremost, the fact that the Pahlavi dynasty, that's the Shah, and his ancestors were ruling, and then things changed in World War II. So could you take us through from World War II onwards?
Absolutely. So the problem was that once the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, there were lots of calls for a pan-Islamic state. We call it the Khilafat movement, Caliphate movement, whatever the name was. But at that time, what's called the Sunni-Shia rivalry within the Muslim world did not really play a very big role. But after the Second World War, and particularly once the Cold War got going, you had the United States consolidating many of its allies in the region. And many of those allies were not necessarily popular leaders within their own countries. So the Pahlavi dynasty, even though it was a moderately secular regime and all that, and they had good relations with Israel, there was a lot of internal dissent that was crushed very brutally. There were popular uprisings that were crushed very brutally. and it ended in the 1979 revolution with Ayatollah Khomeini taking over. Now, Israel, as we mentioned earlier, had a very good relationship with Iran until then. When I mean very good, it's not that they were best friends. There were differences. Even the Shia did publicly speak out against some of Israeli policies and all that. But the two of them did have a good working relationship. And even after that, with the Iran-Iraq war and all that, with the Israelis secretly backing the Iranians, things were okay. It's only been in the post-Cold War world, in the 90s, the 2000s and onwards, that the relationship between them has deteriorated even further. Many initially saw the two as natural allies, because here you have two non-Arab geopolitical powers vying for influence in the Middle East. So the initial assumption was that civilizationally, these two were natural allies to team up against the Arabs. But for whatever reason, once you had the Ahmadinejad presidency from 2005 onwards in Iran, with a lot of inflammatory language about how we're going to wipe Israel off the map if we get nuclear weapons and blah, blah, blah. There was a lot of inflammatory language calling into question the existence of Israel itself. And that's when things really turned bad. So you had the Lebanese civil war, you had lots of different proxy conflicts, and this is the consequence of that. This is not a spontaneous thing that has erupted over the last 2 weeks. This has been brewing for the last 40 to 45 years.
But also, Nilanthan, in 1953, there was a coup in Iran,
yes,
where the US and the UK played a big role. It was they
to
were
help the
ones.
Pahlavis.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, to help the Pahlavis. And this was also only 3 years before Egypt tried to nationalize Suez and all that. Right after that, there was the 1956 Suez Canal kind of flare-up as well. So throughout the 50s, as I was saying, it was very important for the United States and its allies to make sure that their people were placed in power for generational rule. This is the other thing that we need to keep in mind. Whether it's the Americans supporting the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis, or the Americans supporting the Pahlavi dynasty, what they were looking for was generational support rather than simply support that lasts for one electoral cycle, which is what typically, let's say, people would expect from a country like us. Whereas here, they were playing the long game. They were playing the long-term game, and the military coup of 1953, trying to take over Suez in 1956, and all the subsequent US policies in the Middle East were for a path ahead for the next century rather than simply for the next 5 or 6 years.
Right. And I mean, the underlying theme behind all this is the oil, isn't it? Because most of the Middle Eastern countries have large reserves of oil, and the world depends on it, especially the Western world. You don't see this kind of intervention in the middle of Africa or something like that,
where far worse genocides are happening.
Exactly. That situation with oil hasn't changed at all over the last 100 years or so, I guess.
Yes, and people thought that it would change with the rise of renewable energy, but after the shale revolution in 2008 with fracking and all that, and now with people now kind of pushing back against environmental regulation. So if you had asked me this 10 years ago, the environmental lobby was very strong in terms of compelling countries not to industrialize too quickly, not to drill too quickly, not to depend on, to cut down on their carbon emissions, not to depend on carbon-based fuels and all that. Whereas now, because the global economic situation is deteriorating, the conversation is once again about how the environment can wait. It's economic imperatives that need to be met. And therefore now the traditional sort of sources of energy like oil and all that are back at an all-time high in terms of demand and acceptance. And you don't really find countries now speaking about how they're going to reduce their carbon footprint drastically and stuff like that. Everybody has now realized that the traditional fuel sources are needed for the economies to move forward.
And it was just less than 5 months ago when President Trump took office, on his very first day in office, in his speech, he said, "Drill, baby, drill."
Yes.
So he gave the green light to the oil industry, and I'm sure all the Middle Eastern nations understood what he was saying, and they jumped on it. And when he visited Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, they treated him like royalty, or even better, didn't they?
Absolutely. And these economies themselves know that they need to start moving away from oil and all that, because they're running out too. Because they have long-term planning as well. They know how many decades this would last, and they know that this is not going to last forever, and that the United States is soon going to become the largest oil producing nation in the world. So we're going to go from a situation where geopolitics is shaped by Americans wanting Middle Eastern oil, or Americans wanting to protect their client states like the Saudis and the Israelis and all that. And we've already come to a situation where the Americans are net exporters of natural gas and oil. I mean, some of those things in Alaska, which Trump now unlocked on day one with his executive orders, some say that even one of those wells has more oil and gas there than the whole of Saudi Arabia put together. So this is a major energy revolution that's now being unlocked by Trump as well. Whether or not the United States actually has the refining capacity and all that to actually put this to good use is a separate question. But in terms of the raw materials themselves, oil is here to stay, and the Americans are going to be the leaders, not the Middle East. And the Middle East needs American support to diversify. So many of the investments that the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis have now pledged for the United States, that shows that they're looking to diversify into many other industries and not just stick to the traditional oil base that they have.
So that brings us back to your first point, that the Israeli leadership may have felt that they are looking less relevant with Trump in office, that it's oil and money which talks, and that's the way the world will go for several years, maybe the next decade. So your point that this is their way of,
This is their last chance to influence the Middle East in a big way. If they let this go, they're not going to get a chance like this again, because the Shia dynamic, that Iran is a very, very important part of the overall Middle Eastern equation. The Saudis being the de facto unspoken leaders of the Sunnis, and the Iranians being the kind of de facto unspoken leaders of the Shias. Iran plays a huge role in that overall calculation. And if the Israelis let this go, they know that they're not going to get another chance, and they know that the Americans are already quite wary of giving them the green light for certain things, and this wariness is only going to increase.
We are in conversation with Nilanthan Niruthan, Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies. We'll take a short break right now. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
By delaying these state-owned enterprises reforms, we are drifting from a takeoff hope by people.
And you all couldn't join hands to form the presidency in the country.
The presidency,
It's sad,
the
isn't it?
national leadership was on a very specific, platform.
We didn't have a single council in our control before we went into the election. Now we have 151 already.
There was a huge argument where the government is actually curtailing the rights of the opposition leader when he wants to question. Now where is parliamentary democracy when it comes to all this?
What is the SLPP doing to make itself, more marketable to the people, or at least to rebuild trust among the people?
So I think you need the fire. You need the fire in the belly, and you need to take this government on by the horns.
And you were saying, nothing has been proved in court. But then, no, not a single conviction.
No, there are many things have been proved.
I was just responding to what you said.
Now there are a number of politicians
I was just
of
responding
our
to what you
clan
said.
has been put into the jail. There are
Now you're
number of politicians.
changing what you said.
No. I
Yes,
have
you
never
said-
changed my
you
position.
said nothing
I
has
am a
been proved in
politician
court.
who is known in any media
30 minutes ago
for
you said
not
nothing has been
changing
proved in
my
court.
position any day.
Face the Nation every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. on TV1.
With your name, your unique talent, your phone number. To Sri Lanka's Got Talent PO Box 100 Ratmalana or WhatsApp us on 076 599 7788.
Far from the city noise, under a mango tree, children turn broken desks into a stage. They sing, they dance, they try. No bright lights, no big crowds, just a small school and big dreams. Change is coming. An open-air stage for the Kattaragama Primary School. Gammetta, for the people, by the people.
Let's move on with WeForce, together for a better tomorrow. Join us at the University of Kelaniya on the 23rd of June, 2025.
We've got some fresh new young talent doing some things that I know you haven't heard before.
ඔබ වයස අවුරුදු 16ට වැඩි නම්
සුවිශේෂී නර්තන රිද්මයන්ගෙන් යුක්ත නම්
ඔබේ හැකියාව රටට පෙන්වීමට හොඳම වේදිකාවයි මේ.
ඔබ සමාජිකයන් 15 අතර කණ්ඩායමක් සමගින් අදම අයදුම් කරන්න.
Sirasa Dancing Star.
නිෂ්පාදක සිරස ඩාන්සිං ස්ටාර් තැපැල් පෙටිය 100 රත්මලාන. WhatsApp 071
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am in conversation with Nilanthan Niruthan, Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies, and we are, of course, discussing the alarming situation in the Middle East. Now, Nilanthan, something which the world doesn't seem to discuss is the attitude of some of the Arab nations when it comes to this particular conflict. And it struck me that you have these missiles and drones from Iran, which on their way to Israel, certainly Jordan is shooting down and has very publicly said that they've shot down many of these objects which are on their way to Israel, because it's crossing Jordanian airspace. But that's a very interesting aspect, don't you think? And we saw this in the last little conflict last year as well, which is something new. It's something different, because after all, basically they're helping Israel.
That's the basic elephant in the room that many discussions completely miss out, which is that most of the Arab countries are either secretly, or in Jordan's case, not so secretly, on Israel's side in this exchange, where, as you rightly pointed out, not only did they take down incoming Iranian drones and missiles and all that, they kind of did it quite openly and proudly as well, stating that they had complete control over their airspace and that unauthorized projectiles cannot really enter their airspace, because for many of these countries, that's a question of national pride as well. And even if you look at the general Israeli picture itself, most Arab countries in the region are not that keen on pushing Israel too much, because they don't want to help the Palestinians either. So, for example, this whole Rafah crossing, the Philadelphia corridor with Egypt and Israel, where all the hostages are clustered up. Yes, you can criticize Israel for the treatment of the people there, but what about Egypt, which claims to, shed tears for the Palestinians all the time, but they will not let a single Palestinian come into Israeli territory? Or in the case of, let's say, Jordan, where they did take the Palestinians in, but they feel that the Palestinians betrayed them by trying to overthrow the king of Jordan. Or in the case of the Kuwaitis often say, look, we were one of the most pro-Palestinian Arab populations in the Middle East, But when Saddam Hussein invaded us, the Palestinians stabbed us in the back and openly supported Saddam. So many of these Arab countries do not necessarily see the Israel-Palestine question as a black and white question of the Israelis are the bad guys and the Palestinians are the good guys. There might be a lot of political rhetoric which suggests that, but when we look at their actions rather than their words, most Arab countries, when it suits them, are more than happy to side with the Israelis, as we are seeing right now. I mean, there's been absolutely no effort taken by any Arab country to bolster Iran's attack against the Israelis. If anything, as you rightly pointed out, it's the opposite that's happening. And Iran's proxies in the region, so the Houthis in Yemen, are doing their best, but there's nothing much that they can do from where they are, because physically there's the large country of Saudi Arabia that needs to be traversed before they can actually do anything in Israel. Hamas is now too busy fighting an offensive of its own, where a lot of its infrastructure has been taken out at great tragic civilian cost, but taken out nonetheless. Hezbollah, almost 70% of Hezbollah's leadership has been wiped out. Almost 70% of Hezbollah's tunnels and logistical capabilities have been wiped out. So Iran's proxies are unable to do anything either.
And Syria, of course, has
now completely collapsed, and it's no longer an Iranian proxy state. So Iran always depended on its proxies rather than the Arab states to swipe at Israel. And now that the proxies are all incapacitated, so to speak, we see how Iran's helplessness is exacerbated by the Arabs tacitly supporting the Israelis.
Now, you mentioned something interesting earlier, that Israel sees Iran at its weakest, which wasn't quite apparent earlier, because as you said, Iran was fighting Israel through proxies. But as you quite rightly put it, the Gaza situation has led to a drop in prestige for Iran, and then the Hezbollah situation in Lebanon, again a drop in prestige, and most of all the
fall of Syria.
The fall of Syria. So all of a sudden, all these regions, all these states where Iran was, backing someone or the other, that's all being swept aside. So Iran is on its own.
Yes.
So the Israelis may have felt this is the time.
And over the last few years, there have been consistently large public protests in Iran as well. So for example, a few years ago, there were the big protests about the headscarf,
right,
where a girl was arrested by the moral police and the girl died.
Yes.
And many thousands and thousands of Iranians were arrested by the Iranian government for protesting. So the Israelis feel that militarily they are at their weakest at the moment because their proxies have been wiped out. Economically, they are at their weakest because the economy is crashing. And one of the reasons the Iranians wanted to get that nuclear deal back with the Americans is because that would have been an economic path to recovery. So militarily, economically and culturally, with now this younger Iranian demographic that is not willing to abide by certain moral codes and all that, the Israelis feel that this converges into a nice intersection where the Iranians are at their weakest. Once again, it might end up being wrong. Remember, these are not our calculations. These are just the Israelis' calculations. So on the surface, it looks like they've calculated accurately, but you never know what's going to happen. Regime change, as you pointed out, is such a cauldron, is such a Pandora's box, so to speak, that a year from now, the two of us could be sitting here going, what were we thinking a year ago? We should have clearly seen this disaster coming. Or we could be saying, remember how worried we were a year ago, and things have turned out so well.
Now, one of the reasons that the whole world is so on edge over this is because much of the world's oil comes out of the Persian Gulf, the Gulf. And there is this choke point, the Strait of Hormuz, which I think at its narrowest is something like 21 kilometers across, which is nothing. I mean, it's the distance from Mana to Rameshwaram is much more than that.
Yes.
So this is a very narrow choke point, and the fear is that Iran could act against the world's oil supplies by blocking this, and there are many methods to do so, although one can't see the rest of the world just sitting around. The US in particular would not allow that, but it's something which the world is very cognizant of.
Yes.
How realistic is it for Iran to try to block that Strait of Hormuz?
So it would depend on how they tried to block it. If they tried military means to harass ships that were going to and fro that region, then there's a heavy American presence there, naval presence, which is strengthening day by day, week by week, which will then be authorized to act militarily as well. So there are two straits that two choke points that technically the Iranians control. One, as you rightly pointed out, is the Strait of Hormuz. The other is the Bab el-Mandeb, right below, which is because the Iranians have
Red Sea
Houthi,
and the Arabian.
they have the Houthi proxies there as well. So there are technically two choke points that the Iranians control, and as you rightly pointed out, a large part of the world's oil and shipments and all that pass through that, and they're so small that disrupting it will not be too difficult. I mean, the Houthis are a ragtag organization, to be polite about it, but even they were able to have such a big impact on global trade with the few rudimentary, missiles and rocket launchers and all that they have. Because as you pointed out, these choke points are so small, they're so narrow, that you don't need a lot of resources to disrupt what's going on there. But if Iran went for a huge escalation where they try to hold global trade itself hostage, then it would only incentivize the other side to act even quicker, perhaps with even more brutality. I mean, remember the Kuwait invasion by Saddam Hussein, where the second Iraq war in 2003 was met with a lot of protests. A lot of people didn't like George Bush Jr. It was a very unpopular war. But the first Kuwaiti, the first Iraqi war was done, I mean, everybody in the world almost cheered at that, because that was a choke point of the world economy. And Saddam taking control of Kuwait basically meant that the world economy was a hostage of Saddam Hussein. So in that case, global opinion and the imperative to crush the enemy takes over, rather than moral considerations and all that. So if the Iranians did try to hold the global economy itself as their prisoner, I think it would backfire on them.
Now, how likely is Donald Trump to go to war, to intervene in this on the side of the Israelis against the Iranians? And I ask this in the backdrop of we've already seen more than 30 tanker aircraft, which are refueling the aircraft, moved from North America to Europe and the Middle East. So they are already there, and those aircraft, they're basically flying gas tanks. So they would refuel any further aircraft, jet fighters, bombers, and so on, which would come from the United States. So basically, aircraft from the US are now more than capable of reaching the Middle East without touching down anywhere, and flying all the way back as well, if necessary. What this means is that the US doesn't have to depend on bases in Europe, like Italy or so on. And then also we have a second carrier battle group, which we know left the South China Sea, where they were actually, I think they were there in the South China Sea as a sort of telling the Chinese that, our presence is there in the South China Sea, but now they've been routed to the Arabian Sea.
Yes.
And I think right now they must be somewhere passing Sri Lanka, far away from our coast, of course. And in a couple of days, possibly over the weekend, that carrier group, which is the Nimitz group, would also join the existing. There is one carrier group already in the Arabian Sea. I think the USS Carl Vinson. So that's an enormous amount of firepower.
Yes.
Each of these carriers has about 100, up to 100 jet aircraft. So it's enormous. And then you have just south of the Maldives, you have Diego Garcia, which is one of the largest US bases in the world. So you have all this firepower, and then you have President Trump, who's been saying some certain things very clearly. He's called on Iran to surrender, unconditional surrender and so on. How likely are we to see, say, in the next week, US forces intervening here?
Okay, so let's look at what's stopping Trump and what's incentivizing Trump. So what if Trump does not intervene? That would be because of one major factor, which is that even within what would be called the cultural MAGA movement or the alt-right movement, because Trump is a cultural figure as well. Whether we like it or not, there's a certain age demographic, particularly among young males, who gravitate towards Trump on a cultural rather than a political level. So Trump, as you remember in 2016, how he even got the nomination was by destroying Jeb Bush in all the debates, where he said, you and your entire family have dragged this country through numerous wars for your own selfish reasons, particularly in the Middle East. And it's about time that we got a president who stopped all that. So Trump, especially the first Trump presidency, was predominantly Trump supporters rather than the conventional Republicans. What's happened with this Trump presidency is that it's been a mix of the two. Many of the traditional, almost all, if not all, the traditional Republican war hawks have also more or less bent the knee to Trump, and they've kind of joined the Trump camp as well. So all of these hawks want the United States to go to war in favor of Israel, to help Israel. Whereas Trump's original vote bank, the vote bank that got enthralled, enchanted by Trump for all his anti-war rhetoric, like a Tucker Carlson, for instance, if I was to just name a media personality who kind of has some level of influence on the American discourse, maybe not on policy, but certainly on culture and political discourse. So there's now a major war between the two major Trump factions, the anti-war cultural right and the traditional Republican right. So if this anti-war cultural right can pressure Trump enough, that would be the reason why this does not escalate. But the imperatives to escalate, I mean, number one, not only is the Israeli lobby in the United States strong, but the Arabs, the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis also need Trump to guarantee them that Iran will not nuclearize, because the United States is now providing security for their entire Arab Gulf region. So there's a great deal of pressure from the Gulf, the Arabs as well, to prevent Iran from nuclearizing. There's a great deal of pressure from Israel, which we already see, to prevent Iran from nuclearizing. So geopolitically, any American president, considering the allies in the Middle East, would have to support Israel. But domestically, politically, this is going to alienate Trump from many of his original voters who saw him as a cannonball, a wrecking ball against the Washington establishment. Whereas Trump now doing this, if it does militarize, would almost be seen as a sign that Trump has now become a part of what they would call the deep state. A big part of Trump's vote bank is that Trump and Elon Musk and all that fight against what they consider to be the deep state, this hidden, invisible power force. Whereas if Trump militarizes here, they would see Trump as having joined the very establishment that he was supposed to dismantle.
But on the other hand, Nilanthan, this is Trump's second term, and the in the U.S. Constitution limits presidents to 2 terms. So he's not looking at re-election. So he's more likely to do whatever he feels that he wants to do, basically. And also he is always, as we discussed, on the side of money and power and oil, basically. Do you see that the MAGA movement has less influence on him now?
Well, perhaps they have less of an influence on him now, but even Trump personally has made no secrets about the fact that he is gunning for a Nobel Peace Prize. It might be laughable to us, but he, for his own personal legacy and his own business interests going forward into retired life and all that, bringing the Ukrainians and the Russians together if possible. Abraham Accords Part 2 was something that was on the agenda when he came to power 6 months ago. As I said, the Pakistani General Asif Munir is in Washington meeting Trump, and Trump very stealthily and slyly tried to invite Modi to the White House as well at the same time. And Modi's people thankfully saw what was going on, and Prime Minister Modi had to turn down the offer, the invitation. If not, Trump would have had the two of them there with the photo up. That was the entire point. So there are Trump does not want to be remembered as some kind of wrecking machine and a clown and all that. He wants to be remembered as a great statesman. And he truly, whether we like it or not, he truly believes that he's capable of being remembered as a great statesman. So he looks at things economically. There's a certain logic to the things that he does. It might seem illogical to us, and often in most cases it is illogical, but he's not as wild and crazy as people sometimes portray him to be. There's a very calculated strategist somewhere hidden there.
And what about Russia and China? Do they get a say in this? Because Russia, Putin especially, does speak to Trump, and Trump has a lot of respect and a friendship with Putin. Do they have any influence over this?
No, and I would argue that was the point of moving all those naval assets from the South China Sea to the Middle East. It's not necessarily that they want to attack, but that this build-up will not prevent Russia and China from thinking adventurously when going into the future. This is as much a deterrence in terms of Russia and China thinking that they can now enter the picture as it is aimed against Iran. So my thinking is that right now they want to keep that region in a vacuum, in a geopolitical vacuum, where Russia and China cannot come in to save the Iranians. And it's only if there's no other choice, then there will be sort of active American deployment. Maybe the Israelis are going in for a ground invasion, who knows? And they've just told the Americans, look, make sure the others are not going to intervene. We're going to bomb the heck out of Tehran, and we're then going to put boots on the ground. Maybe that's the plan. You never know with Israel either. So, yeah.
But Russia is, of course, preoccupied with the war in Ukraine.
Yes. And they couldn't stop the downfall of Syria even. So what are they going to do with Iran?
Right. And my final question, because we're almost out of time, what, if anything, can small countries like Sri Lanka do except
pray,
watch and pray and tremble and hope that things don't get worse?
We can look at long-term strategy. So obviously, now if we take us as an example, if we were to take Sri Lanka as an example, we don't have the economic or diplomatic power for short-term solutions because we cannot impact it directly. If India and Pakistan go to war tomorrow, I'm sorry, but neither of them are interested in what we have to say. If Russia and Ukraine go to war tomorrow, if Israel and Iran go to war, none of them go to sleep at night wondering what the Sri Lankan position is. So short-term, nor do we have the money to directly influence events. So let's look at some long-term planning. The first step that we've been advocating for so long is let's have a list of what our foreign policy objectives are. If you remember the last time I appeared on Face the Nation, I made the same point. Right now, we do not have a foreign policy doctrine that can be transferred from one party to another. Our foreign policy is simply the prisoner of whichever political party is in power, when a new party comes in, our foreign policy changes. So we are incapable of making short-term contingencies because of our own poverty and lack of influence. We are also incapable of making long-term solutions because there's no political consensus on what our foreign policy objectives are. So if some miracle worker can get all the political parties together and get them to agree on just a few basic points to formulate a foreign policy doctrine with, that itself will be a good step one, which we haven't done yet. And it's not going to cost us anything. It's just going to cost us time.
Absolutely. So a lot to think about, and we will be walking on eggshells along with the rest of the world for a few days or weeks and hoping for the best. My thanks to Nilanthan Niruthan, Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank
Nilanthan.
you for having me.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.